Today, I'm going to show you how to create an advertisement just like the one you're seeing here for Twitter or other forms of social media. I'm using this ad to advertise my upcoming Inktober commission special. When advertising my Inktober commissions, I wanted to show off some previous inks that I've done. And for me, in my opinion, the best way to do that is to create a sort of collage with a bunch of them all together. Now, instead of just creating flat squares or something, I like to create shapes with a little bit of an angle to them. You'll notice that on my Patreon header and my Twitter header as well. So in this tutorial today, I'll show you how to create something pretty similar, and it's actually pretty easy to do once you know the basics of masks and creating shapes and editing shapes. And I'll even show you some tricks you could do to make your text look pretty nice on it as well. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new document. I have two screens going, so sometimes things pop up in another window. I often start every single document I work with in a pretty high resolution, so I have this 3800 by 3800, 300 pixels per inch document template that I use. And you could just click on that to start. Now, Twitter changes its ratios constantly, so you'll want to Google to see what the latest is. However, the latest does happen to be a 2:1 ratio. So you'll click on the crop tool right over here, or you can click C. And then up here you'll have an option for ratio. Now you can enter 2 and hit tab and enter 1, and it'll create a 2:1 ratio for you. So then you'll just right click and hit crop, and then you'll have a nice 2:1 ratio canvas to work with. Now the next thing I'll do is start adding shapes into this space. And actually the best way for me to do that is I'll select the shape tool just to start, but I'll actually hit Command R, and that'll open up the ruler at the top. And I'll click on the ruler and I'll drag to the edge, and it should clip right into space right there. And you'll see why this is important next. But I'll clip there, I'll clip there, and I'll clip there. Cool. And the reason why I do that is because later when I select the rectangle tool here and I want to add a shape, it's much more easier for me just to follow the guidelines I already have. And the rectangle will also snap into the shape, so I don't have to think too much about how large it should be. Now when you use the rectangle tool and you place down a rectangle, this properties panel will show up here, and you could click on this to change the color. You can also click on this here. And just to start, I just pick random bright rainbow colors, so I'll just stick with a red for now. The next thing I'll want to do is, so if I go back to my original one, you'll see I have about 6 images here. So what we can do for this is we could do something similar. I'm actually going to divide this by 5. So you erase the PX, which stands for pixel part, and you hit slash, and you hit 5, and then you hit enter. And that divides just the width by 5. Now the next thing I'll do, so for this one I created just a simple angular shape, but for this one I want to experiment with something a little bit different. I want to create a sort of chevron, if you will. So I'm going to select the pen tool, and I'm going to select add anchor point. And actually I'm going to go to view, new guide, and for horizontal I'm going to add 50%. And that creates a line exactly halfway down the height of my image. So now with the pen tool selected, I'm going to create an anchor point on my shape here. And now I'm going to select the white arrow tool and click on that. Technically it's already selected because I just created this point. However, if you accidentally deselect and you need to select it again, you can use the white arrow tool to select just this point. And I'm going to hit shift and use the right arrow, which will move it forward by 10 pixels each move. So I'm just going to bump it up quite a bit. This is good. Now, if I wanted, I could leave it on this curve, and that actually looks kind of cool, but I actually want to change it to a sharp angle. So I'm going to go to the pen tool again, and holding down, I'm going to select the convert point tool. And what that does is you'll see it creates a sort of like V icon when I mouse over it. Right now it's an anchor point that has a curve built in, but if I click on it with the, sorry, I forget what it's called, with the convert point tool, I can convert it from a curved point to an angular point. Now if instead I had it at an angular point and I wanted to change it back to a curve, I would just use the same convert point tool again and click and drag to create a curve. Now you'll notice when you create a curve this way, you can kind of bend it in any direction, but if you hold shift, that will keep it straight up and down, if you keep your mouse straight up and down with it. So that's a nice way to get back into a simple curved shape if you want, but I actually want an angular shape. And actually I still want to nudge this just a little bit more, so I'm going to go back to the arrow tool, and again this is still selected, but if you accidentally deselected, you just click on the shape and you'll see the various points come up, and I could click on that shape. And I'm just going to nudge this forward again a little bit. Cool. So we have our first shape in here. And I'm actually going to hit V for the move tool, and I'm going to mouse over this guideline here. And I'm going to drag this all the way up and back into the ruler because I don't need it anymore and it's kind of distracting. So now with this shape, we're going to go over to the layers panel here, and I'm going to drag this onto here, and that will create a duplicate of it. Now I put the duplicate behind the previous layer, but that's just for myself. You could decide what works best for you. If you click on the sort of square within a square, double click rather, that will let you choose the color for that shape. So for our purposes, I'm just going to choose like a yellow one. And then I'm going to hold Command T, and then I'm going to click and drag and just move that maybe about here. Cool. So that's my second shape. You can also zoom in to make sure you don't have any errant pixels like I actually do. Right here you could see a tiny bit of white space, so I'm going to nudge that back over. All right, and essentially you repeat that process again. You can also grab two at a time, duplicate those, put them behind. I'm going to change this color to green and this color to blue-ish. Cool. I'm going to shift and grab both of those. I'm going to hit Command T again, and I'm going to move those into place here. I'm going to zoom in and make sure this is where I want it to be, and hit enter, and that should be good. Now we have space for just one more, so I'm going to do this one more time. I'm going to grab the bottom one, make a copy of it, move that copy to the bottom, double click on that square, change the color to purple, Command T, and move this over pretty much all the way really. And hit enter. I'm going to zoom in, make sure that's pretty good. It needs to be nudged over just a little bit. And then you can see I actually still have some white pixels left in here. I can grab the white selection arrow, and with this layer selected, click on it, and that'll reveal all the points for it. And I can grab the top and holding shift grab the bottom points, and you know they're selected because they appear blue. So with those two selected, just hold shift and arrow to the right to kind of extend it beyond the canvas a little bit. So now I have 5 sort of chevron looking spaces that are all color coded. The colors don't matter, I just use that myself to kind of keep track of where things are. But the next part that you'll do is you'll start to add all your artwork into it. So for the sake of this demo, I'm just going to grab some of my postcard inks. Maybe I'll grab the colored ones this time. So let's see, I like this boar. And when you drag something in, it'll put it above your most recently selected layer. So in this case, I had my bottom rectangle selected, so it put it just above that. But you'll just drag this to the very top. I'll lower the opacity a little bit so I can kind of compare where this image is in relation to which shape it's in front of. So I'll hit Command T just so I can grab it and nothing else. And let's find a good space for this. So I think this boar will look good, maybe over this shape. Actually, I kind of like that at the end because that gives room for its nose and you can kind of see something's coming off the back there. So maybe I'll nudge this just a little bit. Cool. And I'll hit enter because I'm happy with where that's being placed. Now this, coincidentally, I guess I chose to put it over the purple one. So I'll drag it down just above the layer where the purple one is. I'm going to right click and select Create Clipping Mask. And you won't notice anything for that, so we'll show it again in the second one. But it essentially masks it so that it only appears over the space where the purple shape is. Now we still have the opacity down, so I'm going to increase that back to 100, and now we have just the artwork. So let me do this again with one more piece. Cool, so here is my leopard piece. I'm going to drag that to the top, lower the opacity a little bit. Cool, now this one, I think this one will look good over the red shape actually, so this could kind of show you what's going on a little bit better. So I'll put that about here, and I'll hit enter. And since I have it just above the red rectangle shape where I want to put it, I can just leave it where it is. Right click, create clipping mask, and now it's just connected to the red shape. And I'll increase the opacity again, and you can see the full color of it. So I'll do that again for all these other 3 shapes, but I'll speed it up a little bit. Cool, So now I have all my art pieces set up and they're all masked to the various shapes. However, you'll notice everything's kind of flat, and so it's kind of not clear where one piece ends and the other one begins. So we're going to add a very simple drop shadow for this. So I'm going to select the topmost shape, which is the red shape on the very left here, and I'm going to right click and select blending options. And in here we'll have a window and we can select drop shadow. And it already saved it from the last time I did this, but basically what you'll want to do is you'll want to change this angle so that the light is coming from the left. So in this case it'll be 180 degrees. And from here, it already has a pretty nice shadow, but you can adjust the distance if you want to make it even longer, the spread if you want to make it wider, and the size if you want to make it an even bigger shadow. But because you do want to show off the art piece next to it, you might want to choose something a bit more subtle. So you might want to lower these a little bit. And of course you can adjust the opacity of the shadow itself. So even if you want a really deep, big shadow, you can lower the opacity if you don't want the shadow to be as intense. So I'll hit OK. And if you're already worrying that you have to do that for every single one, here's another neat trick. You simply right click on it again, select copy layer style, and then using Command on Mac, it might be Control or Alt on Windows, I'm actually not sure, but you'll just select all the other shapes by holding Command and then clicking on each one. And then on any of these selected ones, you just right click and select Paste Layer Style, and that will paste the shadow effect onto all of them. So now you have a very nice shadow separating each of the images you have. The next thing I'll do, just because I like to keep things organized, is I'll grab the very bottom shape all the way to the very top image, and then I'll hit Command G, and that will put everything into a group. I also like to keep organized, so I'll label this. So I'll just label this artwork. And because I want to do some stuff above this, I'm going to lock this group. Now what locking does is, for example, if I select the Move tool, no matter how much I click on it, I can't move things around. I can actually move the background layer, which I did not mean to do, so I'll just go back in my history to when I locked the layers. Now I'm going to create another layer just above this, and I'm going to select my foreground and background color to be black and white, and I'm going to select the gradient tool. And when you have your foreground and background color choices, when you select the gradient tool, it'll automatically generate a gradient using those. So I just want simple black and white. And I want this simple linear gradient choice. And I'll hold Shift and I'll click the very bottom of my image and go to the very top. So that way I have black on the bottom and white on the top. Now you've just covered everything up, but if you change the layer settings to multiply, you'll notice that you can still see the art on the top, but you have some darkness underneath. And what I just noticed actually, I think all my images default to CMYK, but if we're using this image for social media, we can change it to RGB. So I'm going to go to Image, Mode, RGB color. It'll give me a warning, but I'll say don't merge because I want all my layers to be separate. And I'll select don't rasterize because I still want to be able to make adjustments to my shapes if I need to. And there you go. And you'll kind of notice a subtle image change, especially in how that multiply interacts with it. And that's just the way colors interact in RGB versus CMYK are a little bit different. So if you're creating an image that you know is only going to be used online or on a screen and you're using it for social media, you can just stick to RGB, and that might open up some better formatting options for you. Now, if you feel like your gradient is taking up too much space, so for example, it actually stays pretty dark well into the artwork, you can hit Command T and hold Shift and just bring down the top part a little bit, because we only need the very bottom to be kind of dark, so maybe around here-ish is pretty good. Now I'm going to lock that because I'm satisfied with where that is, and I don't want to accidentally click it and make changes. So I'm going to switch so that white is my foreground color, and I'm going to hit the text tool to create some text. So because this is an imaginary ad, let's add 3 pieces of text. So I'm just going to click and drag just so that it's in a confined space, and it'll automatically populate it with some lorem ipsum, and it'll choose the last settings that you had. So the font I use for myself for all my stuff is Dossis, and I'll create this as extra bold, and I'm going to set the line height to auto and just make this pretty big. We'll just call this Salafis Inks as a fun title, and I'll adjust the letter spacing to make it a bit smaller. We'll make another box, and I'll just write now on Patreon. I hit Command Alt to select all the text if it kind of runs out of space, and I'll just kind of adjust to make it a bit smaller. If you want to make it centered, you can hit Paragraph and adjust to make it centered or left aligned or justified. I'll just hit centered for now. I'll change this to extra light because I like how that looks. One other neat trick you can do is if you work with specific websites like Twitter or in my case Patreon, you can collect the colors for it and save it as a brand. So I have Patreon selected here, and if I select the Patreon color, it'll populate it in my foreground color. Now if I select the text again, this is one failing of Photoshop where you can't have your text selected and then choose something from your library. You have to first deselect everything, choose something from your library, and then figure out what you're going to color with it. But that's okay. So I'm going to change the text color to this foreground color to match the Patreon branding. Actually, I'm going to make this just a little bit bigger. One thing to note, if you have some text that's being hyphenated as it skips to the next line, you can select paragraph, and there's this check mark here whether you want to hyphenate it or not. For some reason, by default, it's always on. I like to deselect that so that all my words are pretty clean on the page. So that's looking good. Now we'll make one more text box, and that will be the link. And I bet I spelled that wrong because I ran out of room to watch it. Oh no, that's cool. One thing I just noticed, because it has it saved from the last time I was working with text, is that all of this is in small caps. And maybe you like how that looks. I think it looks good for the header and for this link, but this now on Patreon doesn't necessarily need to be in small caps. So what you can do is select that text, go to your text editor, and then there's these additional options under this little hamburger menu here. And you can see I have small caps selected. I would just deselect that and it'll go back to normal. There's some other options here if you want things to be all caps, if you're really excited about it. If the font you're working with doesn't have its own italic or bold, you can add a faux italic to it. And then if you have something like, let's say I wanted to say Patreon is trademarked, I can add TM, highlight just the TM, go here, and select superscript, and that'll make it smaller and above it. But I don't care about Patreon's trademark, and neither do they, so I'm going to deselect that. So now I have these three distinct text pieces on here, and they look pretty evenly spaced, but I'm not entirely sure. So one thing that I can do is I'm actually going to make this look really nice, and the way I'm going to do that is go to View, New Guide Layout, and you'll notice at the bottom here there's an option for margin. So first of all, if I had that deselected, I could choose instead to add columns. So if I wanted 12 columns, it would evenly space the columns on there. If instead of columns I wanted rows, I could do the same thing. But for this case I'm going to add a margin, and this one actually looks pretty good. So it just kind of defaulted to the last one I used, which is 125 pixels, and that looks good. So basically what I'm doing by adding a margin is making sure that, I know where to put my text so that it's not exactly hugging the edge. And that's just a general good practice. It's especially relevant in printing, but it's also a good idea for digital images as well. It just gives your text and everything enough room to breathe. It makes sure everything's aligned nicely. So I'll set this first text. I'm going to hit Command T just so I can see the box around it, and I'll put it exactly to this left margin. I'll hit Enter. I'm going to grab this one, Command T, and I'm going to put this over here and hit Enter. And actually I can see the text box I made is pretty tall. So I'm going to use the text tool, select it, and I'm going to shrink that box pretty much to the lowest that I need, which is about that. And this one, it doesn't matter where this is, and you'll see why in a second, because I'll go back to my layers here, I'll grab all three, and with the Move tool selected, which is V, or it's at the top here, I'm first going to make sure that they're all level horizontally, so I'll click this button, and now you can see they're all level. Then I already have the leftmost text exactly where I want it on the left. Same with the rightmost text. I just want to make sure everything's evenly distributed. So I'll click on this little icon, which makes sure everything distributes evenly. And there you go. So now since I still have everything selected, I can hit Command T to grab it all at once and move it down to the bottom margin and hit Enter. I'm going to select outside of that, and then I'm going to hit Command colon to hide my guides, and Command R to hide my ruler. You may have different keyboard shortcuts, you'll have to check for yourself. But yeah, so there you have it. We have a nice looking shape to contain several different pieces of art. We have a black gradient on the bottom over which we can put some text to make that stand out. And we have 3 pieces of text that are evenly distributed. You can of course make some final adjustments. So for example, I want to nudge this down just a little bit, and it's actually kind of bothering me that I have this brown ink in the middle, but all the others are sort of like a cool gray. So what I'm going to do, and this is just an extra trick, I'm going to select the artwork, which is of course the artwork in the background, and I'm going to click on this little icon, which is for an adjustment layer, and I'm going to click on Hue Saturation, and I'm going to drag the saturation all the way down, so it's going to make everything an even black and white. And I'll just close that. And so you can see this adjustment layer, it's only impacting the artwork layer because that's what's below it. If I were to drag this all the way to the top, then everything would be black and white. But I only want to impact the artwork, so I'll leave it here. Cool. Thank you for watching. Hopefully you found this informative, and hopefully you can have some fun making your own advertisements, or even if you just want to use this technique for making banners for your social media headers or that sort of thing. It's a pretty cool way to make a nice collage of art and share off your branding and your text underneath. Cool. Thanks for watching.